This is the third part of my conversation with Professor Sue Weiss on Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano, in which you can hear Sue's recommendations on similar and related texts. Please let us know in the comments if you've read any of these or if you have any further recommendations. Welcome to the third and final part of my discussion with Sue Weiss about Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano. If you haven't watched or listened to the first two parts, please do check those out first. And in this final section, Sue will give us some recommendations for any similar or related texts. So, Sue, what do you have for us?
Thanks, Ivan. Well, as we've been saying, Under the Volcano is a little bit of an unusual text. So on the one hand, really, there's nothing like it. But on the other, clearly there are other novels that are set in Mexico and give that kind of slightly outsider perspective on that world, by Graham Greene, also D.H. Lawrence. We've mentioned Ulysses, even though it's, I would say, not as inviting as a text to read as Under the Volcano. Something about the experimentation with language and the use of a multiplicity of voices is quite similar to that. But I suppose when I was thinking about your question about who is similar, I think my fondness for Virginia Woolf and Catherine Mansfield, they seem to me to have slightly more in common with what Lowry is doing, though I don't think you would necessarily think of them right away if you were thinking of Under the Volcano, because immediately the events in either Mansfield or Woolf are much less dramatic seeming than in Under the Volcano. But I think that the kind of the style of writing and the representation of people's inner world, refracted through what somebody's doing in a very day-to-day way with a much bigger significance, and often against the backdrop of big political events, which are just represented in that very small scale way, make them more similar. And I'm thinking, for example, of Mrs. Dalloway in particular, or To the Lighthouse, or any of Catherine Mansfield's stories. So I think they would be the ones that I would think of first to suggest for ones that are similar. Are there any that strike you, Ivan, in thinking about similar?
I mean, not really. I think I'm similar to you. You know, I think I mentioned Ulysses earlier, but it's not that similar. I think Joyce's experimentalism is so much more in your face, with the hitching the structure onto the Odyssey and each section being different. And there's a sort of sustained momentum to Under the Volcano that I really feel is quite unique. And I agree, I hadn't thought of say Woolf at all, actually, until you mentioned her. But I think that kind of rhythm or cadence, almost, if you like, is closer to Lowry. I'm thinking of the timescale, something like Mrs. Dalloway as well, which is one day. So there's that similarity. I don't know if I went more to the subject matter and the sort of, you know, I'm living overseas, so see Brits abroad drinking themselves stupid. So maybe that's my bias, but thinking of people like Hemingway, but obviously he's very, very different in terms of style. But just thinking in terms of that subject matter and kind of, I guess, questions of, I was thinking particularly when you're talking about, you know, Jeffrey's almost need to reject love and to isolate himself, and the way that ties into being in a different geographical location, what that does to people kind of mentally, and almost existentially. So I think I was thinking more of, stories of like when you've got sort of Brits abroad or whoever just kind of going on a downward spiral. But I think stylistically, you're right, Lowry is kind of on his own. I can't think of anything to put next to it. If you really enjoyed that style, what would be very close to it?
Well, what you say is really fascinating. Lowry himself said he was really influenced by Faulkner, but I Faulkner is really great, obviously, but I prefer Lowry. I feel it's more, manages to mix literary experimentation with reality more
Mm,
successfully than even Faulkner does. It's interesting you mentioned Hemingway because I suppose a whole other angle towards Under the Volcano is to think of it as a novel about addiction. Um, and I feel that I used to think it was about addiction to language as well.
mm,
It's almost as if there's an amazing bit where the consul himself tries to envisage all the bottles he's drunk, and he lists them by name, and the names are beautiful, but
mm,
you realize, of course, it's a terrible poison that he's been
mm.
taking all this time. But it's like the writing and the drinking are kind of brought together in a way in that respect. So
Yeah.
it might be that people who are thinking about addiction might think of Under the Volcano, though
Mm.
obviously that's not the only prism through which to view it, as we've been suggesting.
Yeah. As we're talking, actually, one came to mind, which is How Late It Was, How Late by James Kelman, um,
Yes.
Scottish writer, stream of consciousness in Glaswegian vernacular. Um, it's not one day, it's several days, but the protagonist goes blind quite early after getting in a fight with some police and is sort of still staggering around trying to get a drink for much of the novel. Um, and I think the intensity of that is maybe the most similar thing I can think of. Um, Starts with a quite brilliant description of hungover, anxiety, and regret as well. So worth reading for that opening page or two.
That's a great example because I don't think that you would necessarily think of those James Culman and Lowry in the same breath, but I feel exactly that quality of literary experimentation with being really down to earth is
Mm,
exactly what James Culman achieves in that novel, in which you feel exactly as with the consul, you feel protective towards them and horrified at what's happening
yeah,
to them at the same time.
yeah,
Um,
similar kind of tension with the sort of emotional engagement you have. I think frustration with them just not being able to get it together, as well. Yeah.
Yes, I can imagine that that novel could easily appear on a book of lost classics because I can't. Though I think it won the Booker Prize the year it was published, but I'm not sure how many people read that now.
It was controversial. One of the judges, I think, stormed out, and I think it was one of these that had critics kind of counting the number of swear words in it. Um, in '94, I think. Um,
94.
yeah, and Kelman defended his use of the vernacular in his speech, as I remember. Um, but it's interesting that date because I'm thinking, I was growing up during the '90s, and I feel like regional accents became fashionable in the '90s, but maybe Kelman was just before that, or maybe with the wrong audience. Yeah, I think later on you got people like Oasis singing Rawdon and CUNY accents and stuff like that, but maybe the literary sphere was not ready for it yet. I'm not sure.
Well, I think it's still unusual. And again, Baptiste might have something to say about the fact that I remember what struck everybody at the time was the fact that the narrator has the accent. It's not just the characters,
Mm,
which remains unusual. Though, of course, there are other things to say other than the swearing about how do you actually represent a dialect without it looking as if you're othering it in some way.
yeah, yeah. I suppose why I said about that about the '90s is because, of course, Train Spotting was just around
Yes.
then as well, which was a huge hit and very popular. I think more through the film. I don't know if people then went back into the novel, but you'd say a lot of similarities, superficially at least, between those two. So anyway, getting away from Lowry a bit into other writers. Any others you wanted to recommend?
Well, actually, weirdly, Irvine Welsh was in my mind as well because I he's not exactly similar to Lowry, but we used to have a course called Literature and Addiction briefly at Sheffield,
Mm,
and I suppose it was more thematic than stylistic, but we had a great range of authors, one of whom was Irvine Welsh, another was Lowry. Um, it was harder to find female writers on questions of addiction and that kind of thing. I think we had Prozac Nation. So I suppose even if these texts aren't either biographical or autobiographical, they often have an interest in that experimental representation of consciousness. So very wide-ranging novels might make you think of Under the Volcano, even if they're not really that similar.
Mm.
Um, so that's why partly I was thinking of Train Spotting, which has the same thing of kind of horror and dismay and humor, at least.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting novel to go back and read, maybe following this conversation, but generally, because I mean, the film was so big, you have that maybe in your mind, and a lot of the imagery was very memorable. The novel was quite different, I think, from what they came up with for the film. So, yeah, it'd be an interesting case to look at.
I agree.
Mm. Okay, well, thank you so much for those recommendations. Plenty for people to chew on and to get stuck into. Thanks once again for joining me. It's been a great discussion on a great book. And yeah, for those watching and listening, please do get out there and read Under the Volcano and turn it into a bona fide and well-known classic and give it the recognition it's deserved. So thanks once again, Sue.
Thanks, Ivan, and thanks for all your great insights.
Most welcome. Thanks.